The cemetery gates closed behind them with a finality that echoed in James's chest. Lily's small hand remained limp in his as they walked to the car, her black dress too formal for a 7-year-old, too heavy with meaning. The drive home passed in a blur of condolences from neighbors, casserole dishes thrust through car windows, and well-meaning words that felt like static against his grief. Their house stood unchanged, as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis 3 days ago. The yellow roses Grace had planted last spring still bloomed defiantly by the front door, their cheerful faces a cruel contrast to the weight settling over everything. James fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking not from the cold October air, but from the knowledge that when he opened this door, Grace wouldn't be there to greet them. The silence hit him first. Not just the absence of Grace's voice calling from the kitchen or her favorite jazz record playing softly in the background, but something deeper. It was the silence of a house holding its breath, waiting for life to return to its rooms. Lily slipped past him wordlessly, her patent leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor with mechanical precision. "Lily?" he called softly, watching as she paused at the bottom of the staircase. She turned toward him, and for a moment he hoped to see recognition, grief, anything that might bridge the chasm that had opened between them since the accident. Instead, her eyes held that same distant quality they'd carried for weeks, as if she were looking through him rather than at him. She climbed the stairs without a word, each step deliberate and measured. James heard her bedroom door close with a soft click, and then the house settled back into its suffocating quiet. He moved through the familiar spaces like a stranger, noticing details that seemed wrong without Grace's presence to animate them. The coffee maker she'd used every morning at 6:15 sat cold and unused. Her reading glasses lay folded beside a half-finished novel on the kitchen counter, marking a story she would never finish. The throw pillow she always adjusted just so on the living room couch remained crumpled from where she'd last rested her head 3 weeks ago, before everything changed. James sank into his armchair, the one Grace had always teased him about. "Your old man chair," she'd called it, though he was only 34. The familiar embrace of worn leather felt foreign now, as if even inanimate objects mourned her absence. He stared at Grace's empty chair across from him, where she used to curl up with her legs tucked beneath her, reading or working on her crossword puzzles while he watched the evening news. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, its deep voice the only sound in the house. Upstairs he could hear nothing, no footsteps, no drawers opening, no signs of life from Lily's room. She hadn't spoken since the night of the accident, hadn't cried at the funeral, hadn't even acknowledged the stream of relatives and friends who'd tried to comfort her. The doctor said it was trauma-induced mutism, that with time and patience she might begin to speak again. They used clinical words like processing and coping mechanisms. But James saw something different in his daughter's eyes. It wasn't just silence, it was absence, as if part of her had gone with Grace and left only this quiet shell behind. He climbed the stairs an hour later, pausing outside Lily's door. No light showed beneath it, no sounds of movement. He knocked gently. "Lily, are you hungry, sweetheart? I could make some soup." Silence. "We have that tomato soup you like. The one Mom used to make with the little crackers shaped like goldfish." The words hung in the air, unanswered. James pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the door, feeling the weight of his own exhaustion. How was he supposed to help Lily when he could barely breathe through his own grief? How could he be what she needed when he felt like he was drowning? The house seemed to press in around them, filled with memories that felt more like ghosts. Grace's laughter echoing from the kitchen, her voice singing Lily to sleep with old folk songs. The rustle of newspaper pages on Sunday mornings, the clink of coffee cups, the 1,000 small sounds that had made this place home. Now there was only silence, stretching between father and daughter like an ocean neither knew how to cross. 3 weeks into their new reality, James began to notice the small things, the way Lily flinched when he dropped a spoon in the kitchen sink. How she avoided the hallway mirror, turning her face away, as if her own reflection might betray something she wasn't ready to confront. Her drawings, scattered across her desk like silent testimonies, all featured faces without mouths, people frozen in permanent quiet. The school counselor, Mrs. Peterson, called twice that week. Lily was participating in class activities, completing her assignments with mechanical precision, but she remained mute. Her teacher worried about the isolation, the way other children had stopped trying to include her in their games. James listened to these reports with growing helplessness, nodding at suggestions he didn't know how to implement. It was on a Thursday afternoon, while autumn painted the village in shades of amber and rust, that James first noticed Margaret. She was kneeling in the garden of the house next door, the old Henley place that had stood empty for months. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she moved among the overgrown flower beds with patient determination, pulling weeds and clearing space for new growth. James had meant to introduce himself, but grief had made him awkward with neighbors, uncertain how to navigate conversations that inevitably led to condolences and questions about how he was holding up. Instead, he watched from his kitchen window as she worked, admiring the quiet efficiency with which she transformed the neglected garden. That afternoon, walking to collect Lily from school, he finally met Margaret properly. She was carrying groceries from her car, and when a bag split open, sending apples rolling across the sidewalk, James helped her gather them. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "I'm Margaret Chen. I just moved in next door." "James Morrison, and that's our house there with the yellow roses." She smiled. "Grace's roses. She told me about them when she helped me look at the house back in August. I'm so sorry for your loss." The words were familiar, but something in her delivery made them feel genuine rather than obligatory. Before James could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of children emerging from the school grounds. Lily appeared at the edge of the playground, her backpack hanging from one shoulder, her gaze fixed on the ground as she walked toward them. But then something extraordinary happened. Lily stopped walking. Across the street, in the small park that bordered the school, a teenager sat on a bench with an acoustic guitar. His fingers moved across the strings with casual skill, creating a melody that seemed to catch the afternoon light and hold it suspended in the air. Other children passed by without notice, but Lily stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening not just with her ears, but with her entire being. James held his breath, afraid that any movement might break the spell. For the first time since the accident, Lily's expression showed something other than distant emptiness. Her eyes tracked the guitarist's movements, and when he transitioned from one song to another, she took a small step closer to the street. "She likes music," Margaret observed quietly. James nodded, not trusting his voice. Grace had filled their house with music, jazz from her youth, folk songs her grandmother had taught her, classical pieces she'd discovered in college. Since the funeral, James hadn't been able to bear the silence that music left behind when it ended, so he'd kept the radio off, the CD player closed. "I play guitar," Margaret added, so softly that James almost missed it. "Piano, too. If you think she might like to listen sometime." Lily remained transfixed until the teenager packed up his instrument and walked away. Only then did she continue toward them, her brief moment of connection sliding back into familiar silence. But as they walked home together, James, Lily and Margaret, James found himself stealing glances at his daughter's face, searching for traces of the girl who had stopped to listen to music in the afternoon sun. That evening, as he tucked Lily into bed, James mentioned Margaret's offer. "The lady next door plays music," he said, smoothing her blanket. "She said you could listen sometime if you'd like." Lily stared at the ceiling, but James thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, not quite interest, but perhaps the shadow of it. For the first time in weeks, he felt a tiny spark of hope kindle in his chest. maybe silence wasn't the end of their story. Maybe it was just the pause between movements, the breath before the next song began. Margaret's living room was nothing like their own. Where Grace had favored warm yellows and family photographs, Margaret had chosen cool blues and simple lines. A piano occupied one corner, its dark wood gleaming in the afternoon light, while an acoustic guitar rested on a stand nearby. Books lined the shelves, some in English, others in what James guessed was Chinese, and a few pieces of art hung on the walls, abstract enough to suggest emotions rather than define them. "Please, sit wherever you're comfortable," Margaret said, gesturing toward a comfortable sofa positioned to face the piano. She'd extended the invitation 3 days after their first meeting, and James had spent those days debating whether to accept. Part of him feared that exposing Lily to music might shatter whatever fragile peace she'd found in silence. Another part whispered that maybe his daughter was already broken, and he was simply afraid to see the pieces. Lily perched on the edge of the sofa cushion, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes taking in the unfamiliar space. She wore the blue dress Grace had bought her for Easter, a lifetime ago it seemed now, and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that James had managed with only 3 attempts. "I thought I might play something gentle," Margaret said, settling at the piano bench. "Nothing too complicated, just something to fill the quiet." She didn't wait for a response, didn't try to engage Lily in conversation or coax a reaction. Instead, she simply placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. The melody was simple, something that sounded like a lullaby from another culture, notes that seemed to float rather than march. James recognized the wisdom in her approach. No pressure, no expectations, just music existing in the space between them. Lily's posture didn't change, but James noticed that her breathing seemed to slow, matching the rhythm of the gentle song. Her eyes, which had been darting around the room, settled on Margaret's hands as they moved across the keys. For 15 minutes, Margaret played, sometimes switching to different pieces, sometimes returning to variations of the first melody, creating a soundtrack for the afternoon that asked nothing of anyone. When she finished, the silence that followed felt different from the heavy quiet that had dominated their house. This was a comfortable pause, the natural rest that comes after music ends, still humming with echoes of what had been. "Thank you," James said quietly. "That was beautiful." Margaret smiled. "Music doesn't require an audience to participate. Sometimes it's enough just to let it exist." They visited twice more that week. Each time Margaret played for perhaps 20 minutes, never longer, never demanding attention or response. She chose different pieces, classical folk, some original compositions that she mentioned had been inspired by her grandmother's stories. James found himself looking forward to these sessions almost as much as he hoped they were helping Lily. On their 4th visit, something shifted. Margaret was playing a piece in a minor key, something that seemed to capture both sadness and hope in its interweaving melodies, when James noticed that Lily's hands had relaxed in her lap. Her fingers moved slightly, as if tracing the rhythm of the music against her thighs. It was such a small movement that he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so intently. After the music ended, as they prepared to leave, Lily stood by the piano and touched one of the keys with a single finger. The note rang clear and true in the quiet room. She pressed it again, then once more, as if testing whether the sound would remain the same. Margaret watched without comment, but James saw the slight smile that crossed her face. "The piano will be here tomorrow," Margaret said to Lily, her voice matter-of-fact. "And the day after that. Music is patient. It waits for us to be ready." Walking home, James felt something he hadn't experienced since before the accident, a sense that forward movement was possible. Lily's silence continued, but it no longer felt quite so absolute. In Margaret's living room, surrounded by melodies that asked nothing but offered everything, his daughter had touched a piano key and let music touch her back. That night, as he kissed Lily goodnight, James found himself humming one of Margaret's melodies. Lily's eyes flickered toward him, and for just a moment he thought he saw recognition there, not just of the tune, but of the possibility that sound and silence could coexist, that music might be a bridge between the world she'd retreated from and the one waiting for her return. The changes came in whispers rather than declarations. A finger tapping against her leg during Margaret's piano sessions, the slight sway of her shoulders when a particularly melodic passage filled the room. James found himself cataloguing these tiny movements like a scientist documenting the first signs of spring, afraid to acknowledge them too directly lest they disappear. It was during their second week of visits that Margaret introduced the drum, not a full kit, just a simple hand drum with a worn leather surface that seemed to invite touch. She placed it on the coffee table between them without ceremony, as if it had always belonged there. "Sometimes," Margaret said, settling at the piano, "music lives in our hands as much as our ears." She began playing a piece with a gentle but distinct rhythm, something that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the melody. James watched as Lily's gaze moved from Margaret's fingers to the drum, then back again. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, so softly that James almost missed it, Lily placed her fingertips against the drum's surface. She didn't strike it, didn't create sound of her own. She simply rested her fingers there, feeling the vibrations that traveled through the instrument when Margaret's music filled the room. It was as if she were learning to hear through touch, discovering that music existed not just in the air, but in the physical world around her. By the end of that session, Lily was pressing her whole palm against the drum, her eyes closed, absorbing the rhythm through her skin. James felt tears prick his eyes, not the sharp grief that had been his constant companion, but something softer, something that felt almost like gratitude. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Margaret was playing a piece that Grace had loved, not the same song, but something in the same key, with a similar emotional resonance. James recognized it instantly, felt his chest tighten with memory and loss. For a moment, he considered asking Margaret to stop, but something in Lily's posture made him pause. She was leaning forward, her whole body engaged with the music in a way he hadn't seen since before the accident. Her hand moved to the drum, and this time, instead of simply touching it, she tapped it gently with her fingertips. Once, twice, finding the rhythm that Margaret was creating on the piano. The sound was so soft that it barely registered, but to James it was as loud as a symphony. His daughter was making music again, not with her voice, that remained locked away, but with her hands, her body, her willingness to participate in the creation of something beautiful. Margaret noticed too, but she didn't change her playing, didn't draw attention to Lily's participation. She simply continued, allowing space for the quiet percussion that Lily added to the melody. They played together, if such gentle sounds could be called playing, for the remainder of the piece, and when the music ended, Lily kept her hand on the drum as if reluctant to break the connection. That evening, James found himself standing in the doorway of Grace's former music room, a space he'd avoided since the funeral. Her guitar stood in its stand, her sheet music scattered across the desk, her piano bench pushed back as if she'd just stepped away for a moment. He'd been planning to pack everything away, to transform the room into something that wouldn't echo with her absence. But now, thinking of Lily's fingers on that drum, of the way her body had swayed to Margaret's melodies, he wondered if he'd been approaching this wrong. Maybe the room didn't need to be emptied. Maybe it needed to be filled again, but differently. He pulled out his phone and called Margaret. "And was wondering," he said when she answered, "if you might know where I could find a small drum, something like the one you have. I think Lily might be ready for one of her own." Margaret's silence stretched for a moment, and James worried he'd overstepped. presumed too much about her willingness to help them navigate this strange journey back toward sound. "I'll bring mine over tomorrow," she said finally. "She can borrow it for as long as she needs. Music instruments should be played, not stored away." After he hung up, James remained in the doorway of Grace's music room, but the space felt different now. Instead of a mausoleum to what had been lost, it seemed like a workshop waiting for new projects, a studio between compositions. For the first time since the funeral, he stepped inside and sat at Grace's piano. His fingers found the keys awkwardly. He'd never been musical the way Grace was, but he pressed out a simple melody, something half-remembered from childhood. The sound filled the room, neither beautiful nor terrible, just honest. Upstairs, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Lily's door opened and closed softly, and James imagined her standing at the top of the stairs, listening to his clumsy attempts at music-making. He played for a few more minutes, then closed the piano lid gently. Tomorrow, Margaret would bring the drum. Tomorrow, maybe Lily would discover that music could live in their house again, changed but not absent, different but not lost. The confessions came gradually, like water seeping through cracks in a dam. It started with small admissions, how James had stopped listening to the radio because every song reminded him of Grace, how he'd packed away the family photos because seeing Grace's smile felt like reopening a wound. Margaret listened without judgment as they sat in her kitchen after Lily had fallen asleep on the sofa, exhausted from an afternoon of gentle music-making. "I feel like I'm erasing her," James said, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold while he spoke. "Every time Lily makes progress, every time she seems to connect with you, I wonder if I'm letting Grace disappear." Margaret set down her own mug and leaned back in her chair. Outside, October wind rattled the windows, but inside the kitchen felt warm and safe, a place where difficult truths could be spoken aloud. "Tell me about Grace," she said simply. So James did. He told her about Grace's laugh, which had been too loud for movie theaters, but perfect for their living room. He described how she sang folk songs while cooking, how she'd tried to teach Lily guitar, but had been too impatient with the slow progress of small fingers learning difficult chords. He shared memories of summer evenings when Grace would play piano while he and Lily danced in the living room, making up silly choreography that had no purpose beyond joy. She wanted Lily to love music the way she did, James said, but she worried that she was pushing too hard, that she was making it feel like work instead of play. "And now Lily is finding her way to music through different doors," Margaret observed. James nodded, but the movement felt heavy. "That's what scares me. What if Lily learns to love music in ways that don't include Grace? What if the songs you teach her replace the ones Grace used to sing?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and James worried he'd offended her, implied that her help was somehow a betrayal of his wife's memory. But when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "When my grandmother died," she said, "I thought I had to keep everything exactly the same to honor her. Her recipes, her stories, even the way she arranged flowers. But grief isn't a museum, James. It's not about preserving things in amber." She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the garden she'd been slowly transforming. "My grandmother taught me to play piano, but the first song I learned after she died was one she'd never heard. I was terrified that learning new music meant forgetting her music. But the opposite happened. The more I played, the more I could feel her presence in the foundation she'd given me." James thought about this as he watched Margaret's reflection in the dark window. "I don't know how to be what Lily needs," he admitted. "Grace always knew the right songs, the right words. I feel like I'm fumbling in the dark." "Maybe that's exactly what Lily needs," Margaret said, turning back to him. "Someone who's learning alongside her, who doesn't have all the answers." The next morning, James found one of Lily's drawings on the kitchen table. Unlike her recent work, the faceless figures, the empty rooms, this one showed 3 people standing together. He recognized himself and Lily immediately, drawn with the careful attention to detail that children bring to important subjects. The third figure was clearly Margaret, her hair pulled back, her hands positioned as if holding invisible piano keys. But what stopped James's breath was that all three figures had faces. Not just eyes and noses, but mouths as well. Small, careful lines that suggested the possibility of speech, of song, of sounds shared between people who cared about each other. For the first time since Grace's death, Lily had drawn herself as someone who could make noise. That afternoon, during their session at Margaret's house, Lily did something unprecedented. When Margaret finished playing a particularly complex piece, Lily clapped. Not the polite applause of an audience member, but the enthusiastic clapping of a child who had genuinely enjoyed something. The sound filled the room like laughter, unexpected and precious. James felt tears start, but they weren't the tears of grief he'd grown accustomed to. These were tears of recognition, of seeing his daughter emerge from the silence that had held her captive. Margaret caught his eye and smiled, and James realized that this moment didn't diminish Grace's memory. It honored it. Grace had wanted Lily to love music, and here she was, learning to love it again in her own time, in her own way. That evening, as he tucked Lily into bed, James made a decision. "Tomorrow," he told her, "I'm going to try playing Mommy's piano. I'm not very good at it, but I think she'd want the music to continue, even if it sounds different now." Lily looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. It was a small gesture, but it felt like permission. To move forward, to make new sounds in old spaces, to honor the past while building something new. The unraveling began with a lost toy. Lily had been searching for her stuffed elephant, the grey velvet creature that had been her constant companion before the accident and had recently begun appearing at bedtime again. James suggested looking in the guest room closet, where some of Lily's overflow toys were stored, but she shook her head and pointed upstairs, toward the room that had been Grace's. James should have said no. He should have offered to look himself, should have redirected her attention to another toy, another room, another activity. Instead, caught off guard by what felt like the first clear communication Lily had offered in weeks, he nodded. "Just for a minute," he said, "to look for elephant." The room had remained exactly as Grace had left it. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her perfume bottles lined up on the dresser, her books stacked on the nightstand with bookmarks protruding from half-finished stories. James had meant to pack everything away months ago, but each attempt had left him paralyzed with grief and guilt. How do you dismantle a life? How do you decide what stays and what goes? Lily pushed open the door and stepped inside, her movements cautious but determined. James hovered in the doorway, ready to intervene if the memories became too overwhelming. For a few minutes, everything seemed fine. Lily looked under the bed, checked behind the curtains, methodically searching for her missing toy. Then she opened the closet. Grace's clothes hung there like ghosts, still carrying the faint scent of her lavender soap. But it was the blue dress that broke something inside Lily, the one Grace had worn to Lily's school play, the one that had been her favorite for special occasions. It hung at eye level for a 7-year-old, and when Lily saw it, she stopped breathing. The scream when it came was silent. Lily's mouth opened wide, her face contorted with an anguish that seemed too large for her small body, but no sound emerged. She stumbled backward, her hands pressed against her mouth, as if trying to contain something too terrible to release. James reached for her, but she recoiled from his touch, backing into the hallway and then turning to run to her room. Her door slammed with a force that shook the house, and then there was only silence again, but not the peaceful quiet they'd been slowly building with Margaret's help. This was the silence of complete withdrawal, of a door closing against the world. For the next 3 days, Lily refused to leave her room except for meals, and even then she ate mechanically, her eyes fixed on her plate. She wouldn't look at James, wouldn't respond to his gentle attempts at conversation, wouldn't even acknowledge Margaret when she stopped by to check on them. The progress they'd made seemed to evaporate like morning mist, leaving behind only the stark reality of loss. James found himself standing outside Lily's door at all hours, listening for sounds of movement, of tears, of anything that might indicate what was happening in the silence beyond. But there was nothing, and the nothing felt worse than any crying or screaming might have been. On the fourth day, Margaret found him sitting on his front porch at dawn, still wearing yesterday's clothes, looking like a man who had forgotten how to sleep. "She saw Grace's dress," he said before Margaret could ask. "I should have cleaned out that room months ago. I should have protected her from having to see James." Margaret's voice was firm but kind. "You're not responsible for controlling every trigger, every memory. Grief doesn't follow a timeline." "She was getting better," James said, his voice breaking. "She was starting to come back, and I let her walk into that room like it was nothing. I failed her. I failed Grace." Margaret sat beside him on the porch steps, close enough that he could feel her warmth, but not so close that he felt crowded. "When I was Lily's age," she said, "my parents sent me to live with my grandmother after a traumatic experience. For months, I didn't speak. My grandmother never pushed, never demanded explanations. She just existed alongside my silence." James looked at her, seeing something in her expression that spoke of old pain, carefully integrated into wisdom. "One day, something triggered me. I can't even remember what it was now. I retreated completely, wouldn't eat, wouldn't leave my room. My grandmother sat outside my door for 2 days, not talking, not trying to coax me out, just being present. When I finally opened the door, she said, 'Grief isn't a straight line. Sometimes we have to go backward to find a different way forward.'" "How long?" James asked. "How long before she spoke again?" Margaret smiled sadly. She never did speak again the way she had before, but she found other ways to communicate, other ways to connect. And eventually, so did I. That afternoon, James made a decision that felt both impossible and necessary. He knocked on Lily's door. "I'm going to pack up Mommy's room," he said through the wood. "Not to forget her, but to make space for us to remember her differently. You don't have to help, but you can if you want to." There was no response, but James thought he heard movement, perhaps Lily moving closer to the door, listening. "Margaret is going to help me," he continued. "We're going to keep the important things, but we're going to make the room into something new, something that honors Mommy but doesn't hurt us to see." He pressed his forehead against the door, feeling the weight of all the words he couldn't say, all the healing he couldn't force. "I love you, Lily. We're going to get through this, even if it takes a long time." The next morning he woke to find a piece of paper slipped under his bedroom door. It was one of Lily's drawings, a house with windows, a door, and 3 figures standing in the garden. Above them, musical notes floated in the sky like birds, and at the bottom, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, she had written a single word: "Sorry." James held the drawing against his chest and wept, not from grief this time, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that his daughter was still there, still fighting her way back to them through the maze of her own healing. The afternoon sky hung low and grey, pregnant with the promise of rain. Margaret had invited them over despite the weather, or perhaps because of it. There was something about cloudy days that seemed to call for indoor music, for the warm glow of lamps and the intimate sound of piano keys in a small room. Lily had been reluctant to leave the house. Since the incident with Grace's dress, she'd retreated into a careful distance, participating in their music sessions, but with a guardedness that hadn't been there before. She sat further from the piano now, closer to the door, as if she needed to know that escape was always possible. "I thought we might try something different today," Margaret said, settling at the piano bench. "Something you can do with me, not just listen to." She patted the bench beside her, leaving space for Lily to join her if she chose. For several minutes, Lily remained on the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. James held his breath, remembering the doctor's warnings about not pushing too hard, not expecting too much too soon. But then, with movements as careful as a bird approaching seed, Lily stood and crossed to the piano. She sat on the very edge of the bench, leaving several inches between herself and Margaret, her body angled toward the door. "We don't have to make complicated music," Margaret said, her fingers finding a simple melody in C major. "Sometimes the most beautiful songs are the ones that use just a few notes." She showed Lily where to place her right hand on the keys, demonstrated the simple pattern that would complement the melody she was playing with her left hand. It was basic enough for a beginner, complex enough to feel meaningful. Lily's fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, then pressed down tentatively. The notes that emerged were clear and true, fitting perfectly into the musical conversation Margaret had begun. Lily played the pattern once, twice, then looked up at Margaret with something that might have been surprise. They were making music together, real music, and it was beautiful. For 20 minutes they played, Lily growing more confident with each repetition, occasionally varying the rhythm or adding her own small flourishes. James watched from his chair by the window, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell of this moment, when his daughter seemed to be returning to herself one note at a time. It was during a particularly lovely passage, when their playing had found a rhythm that seemed as natural as breathing, that it happened. The melody they were creating together began to echo something familiar, not exactly the same as any song Grace had sung, but in the same emotional key, carrying the same warmth and tenderness that had filled their house during happier times. Lily's hands stilled on the keys. She stared down at the piano, and James saw her chest rise and fall with the kind of deep breathing that comes before tears or laughter or words that have been held back too long. Margaret continued playing softly, creating a gentle musical backdrop for whatever was about to unfold. Lily lifted one hand from the keys and placed it flat against her chest, over her heart. Her mouth opened slightly, and James leaned forward, every cell in his body focused on his daughter. "Mama," she whispered. The word was so soft that James almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. But then she said it again, clearer this time, and the sound broke through the careful walls they'd all built around their grief. "Mama." James was on his knees beside the piano bench before he realized he'd moved, his arms around Lily as she finally let the tears come. They weren't the silent tears she'd shed at the funeral, but the deep, cleansing sobs of someone who'd been holding back an ocean of feeling. "I miss her," Lily whispered against his shoulder, her voice raw from months of disuse. "I miss Mama so much." "I know, sweetheart," James said, his own tears making it hard to speak. "I miss her too. So much." Margaret had stopped playing, but she remained at the piano, her hands resting quietly on the keys as father and daughter held each other in the aftermath of Breakthrough. Rain began to tap against the windows, gentle at first, then with increasing intensity, as if the sky was weeping alongside them. They stayed like that until the worst of the storm passed, both the one outside and the one that had been brewing in Lily's heart for months. When they finally separated, Lily's face was streaked with tears, but somehow brighter, as if crying had washed away some layer of distance that had been clouding her features. "Can we play more music?" she asked, her voice still hoarse but growing stronger. "Something for Mama?" Margaret smiled and placed her hands back on the keys. What was her favorite song? Lily thought for a moment, then hummed a few notes of a folk melody that Grace had sung during bedtime routines. Margaret listened, then began to play a gentle arrangement of the tune, leaving space for Lily to add her own simple harmony. As they played together, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, James felt something shift in the room, in his heart, in their small family's understanding of what it meant to move forward. Grace's absence would always be with them, but so would her love of music, her belief in the healing power of melody and rhythm and voices joined together in song. When they finished playing, Lily turned to Margaret with tears still shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, the words clear and strong and full of meaning. Margaret reached over and smoothed a strand of hair from Lily's face. "Thank you for letting music back in," she said simply. "Your mama would be so proud of how brave you've been." The transformation began on a Saturday morning in November, when the autumn light slanted through Grace's bedroom windows with a golden warmth that seemed to bless the difficult work ahead. James had spent the previous week mentally preparing for this day, making lists of what to keep, what to donate, and what to store away for Lily when she was older. Margaret arrived early, carrying coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, as if she understood that this task would require both sustenance and gentle fortification. Lily hovered at the edge of the room, no longer afraid, but still cautious, like someone testing the temperature of water before diving in. "We'll take it slow," James said, as much to himself as to the others. "If anyone needs a break, we take a break." They started with the closet, James handling Grace's clothes, while Margaret and Lily sorted through jewelry boxes and scarves. Each item carried its own weight of memory: the sweater Grace had worn to their first Christmas together, the dress she'd chosen for Lily's first school play, the collection of vintage band T-shirts from her college years that she'd refused to throw away, despite their holes and faded graphics. "Tell me about this one," Margaret said, holding up a deep blue cardigan with pearl buttons. "She wore that when she was nervous," James said, surprised by how easily the memory came. "Job interviews, parent-teacher conferences, the day we brought Lily home from the hospital. She said it was her armor." Lily reached out to touch the soft wool. "It smells like her perfume," she said quietly. "Can we keep it?" They created 3 piles: items to donate to charity, things to pack away in memory boxes, and special pieces that would find new homes in their daily life. The blue cardigan went into the 3rd pile, along with Grace's favorite coffee mug, her worn copy of poetry books, and the small music box her grandmother had given her as a child. The work was harder than James had anticipated, not because of the grief, though that came in waves, but because of the love. Every object told a story of Grace's life, her dreams, her connections to the people and experiences that had shaped her. Letting go felt like betraying those stories, even when holding on felt like drowning in them. "What about this?" Lily asked, pulling a guitar case from the back of the closet. James recognized it immediately: Grace's old acoustic guitar, the one she'd played in college coffee shops and later used to teach Lily her first songs. He'd forgotten it was there, hidden behind winter coats and boxes of seasonal decorations. "Mama tried to teach me to play," Lily said, running her fingers along the case's worn leather handle, "but my fingers were too small for the chords." Margaret knelt beside her. "Fingers grow," she said gently. "Maybe someday you'll be ready to learn again." Then, by afternoon, they had cleared the closet and dresser, transforming the space from a museum of Grace's life into something that felt more like a workshop for memory. James had worried that removing Grace's possessions would make her feel more absent, but the opposite seemed to be happening. With the clutter of everyday objects gone, the room felt more spacious, more ready to hold the important things. "What should we do with the room now?" James asked as they took a break, sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes and bags. Lily looked around thoughtfully. "Could we make it into a music room?" she asked. "Like where Mama used to play piano, but different." The idea felt perfect in a way that James couldn't quite articulate. Grace's old music room downstairs had become a shrine, too precious to disturb. But this space could be something new, a place where Lily could learn and grow, where music could live without the weight of trying to recreate what had been lost. They spent the next week transforming the room. James moved Grace's piano upstairs, positioning it by the window where the morning light would be best for reading music. Margaret contributed a comfortable reading chair and helped them organize Grace's sheet music collection. Lily arranged her art supplies on a small desk, creating a corner where she could draw while listening to music. The walls, which had been covered with family photos that were now carefully stored in albums, became home to Lily's artwork. Her drawings had evolved since that first breakthrough. Faces now had mouths, houses had open doors, and musical notes floated through many of her compositions, like visual representations of hope. On the day they finished, James found Lily sitting at the piano, not playing, but simply touching the keys one at a time, listening to each note as if hearing it for the first time. The afternoon light caught in her hair, and for a moment she looked so much like Grace that James's breath caught. "It feels different now," Lily said without looking up. "Sad, but not scary." James sat beside her on the piano bench, the same one where Grace had spent countless hours practicing and composing. "That's because we're not trying to keep everything exactly the same," he said. "We're letting it grow and change, the way Mama would have wanted." That evening, as they stood in the doorway of the newly transformed room, Margaret made an observation that surprised James with its insight. "Grace's music was always about bringing people together," she said. "This room feels like it's carrying on that tradition, just in a new way." James nodded, understanding what she meant. The room no longer belonged solely to Grace's memory. It belonged to their family's future, to Lily's growing relationship with music, to the healing that happened when love evolved rather than simply endured. Before bed, Lily played a simple melody on the piano, just a few notes that Margaret had taught her, nothing complicated or ambitious. But the sound filled the room with life in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new, like a conversation between past and present, between the mother who had loved music and the daughter who was learning to love it too. 6 months later, the elementary school auditorium buzzed with the nervous energy that always preceded student performances. Parents adjusted cameras, siblings fidgeted in uncomfortable chairs, and backstage, children in their best clothes whispered last-minute reminders to each other about where to stand and when to begin. James sat in the third row, his hands folded in his lap to keep them from shaking. Beside him, Margaret checked her phone for the time, then reached over to squeeze his arm reassuringly. This was Lily's first public performance since before the accident, a simple folk song she'd chosen to play on piano for the school's spring concert. "She'll be wonderful," Margaret whispered, though James caught the slight tremor in her voice that suggested her own nerves. The past months had been a gradual symphony of healing, marked not by dramatic breakthroughs, but by quiet moments of growth. Lily had returned to speaking, though she still chose her words carefully, as if she'd learned during her silence that language was precious and shouldn't be wasted. Her relationship with music had deepened and evolved, moving beyond the simple melodies Margaret had first shared to include her own compositions, small pieces that seemed to capture feelings she couldn't yet express in words. The music room upstairs had become the heart of their home in ways James never could have predicted. Most evenings found them there together, Lily practicing piano, while James attempted guitar chords he'd been meaning to learn for years, Margaret joining them twice a week for what had become their informal family music lessons. It wasn't the same as the musical household Grace had created, but it was theirs, built from their shared love and patient healing. The curtain rose, and 23 second graders filed onto the stage with the careful precision of children who'd been rehearsing for weeks. Lily stood at the small piano position stage left, her dark hair pulled back with the same blue ribbon Grace had worn to her own childhood recitals, one of the treasures they'd kept from the memory room. James's chest tightened as he watched his daughter settle at the piano bench, adjusting the microphone that would carry her music to the back of the auditorium. She looked so small up there, so vulnerable, and for a moment he worried they'd pushed her toward this performance too soon. But then Lily placed her hands on the keys, looked out into the audience until she found his face, and smiled. Not the careful, protective smile she'd worn for months after finding her voice again, but the radiant, unguarded smile that had been Grace's gift to both of them. She began to play. The song was Scarborough Fair. arranged simply enough for young fingers, but with enough complexity to showcase the musical intuition that seemed to flow through her like inherited grace. Her touch was confident but gentle, each note clear and purposeful, and James felt his throat constrict with pride and wonder. But it wasn't just Lily's technical skill that moved him. It was the way she inhabited the music, the way her whole body seemed to sway with the melody, as if she were dancing with an invisible partner. This was what Grace had always hoped for. Not perfection, but connection, the kind of musical expression that came from the heart rather than the head. Halfway through the song, something unexpected happened. Lily began to sing. It wasn't part of the planned performance. The program clearly stated piano solo next to her name. But as she reached the chorus, her voice joined the melody, soft at first, then growing stronger. The words floated over the audience like a blessing. Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. James felt tears start, not from sadness this time, but from overwhelming gratitude. His daughter was singing again, publicly, joyfully, her voice carrying Grace's love of folk music into a new generation. Around him, he could hear other parents shifting in their seats, caught off guard by the beauty of this unplanned moment. When the song ended, the auditorium erupted in applause. Lily stood and curtsied, then looked directly at James and Margaret, her smile so bright it seemed to illuminate the entire stage. She mouthed two words that only they could see. Thank you. After the concert, as they waited in the lobby for Lily to change out of her performance dress, Margaret turned to James with tears in her eyes. Grace would have been so proud, she said. James nodded, unable to speak around the emotion lodging in his throat. Grace would have been proud, but more than that, she would have understood that this moment wasn't about replacing her memory or moving past her influence. It was about carrying her love forward, transformed by grief and healing into something new, but no less precious. Later that evening, back in their music room, Lily played the song again, this time for an audience of two, in the golden light of the table lamp Grace had bought at a flea market years before. But she also played other things, a melody she'd composed herself, a duet with Margaret on guitar, and finally, at James's request, one of Grace's old folk songs, sung in a voice that was entirely Lily's own, but carried echoes of her mother's musical heart. As the last notes faded and evening settled around them, James realized that they had done something he'd once thought impossible. They had learned to live with loss without being consumed by it, to honor the past while building toward the future, to let music heal them without expecting it to erase their pain. The silence Grace had left behind hadn't disappeared. It never would. But it had been transformed into something richer and more complex, a space between notes where love lived on, where memory and hope could coexist, where a father and daughter could learn to make new music together while still hearing the echoes of old songs that would always be part of their family's symphony. Outside, spring rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like gentle applause. Inside, three people who had found each other through music and loss continued playing, their voices joining in harmony as the evening deepened around them. Proof that even in the aftermath of tremendous grief, beautiful things could still grow.